Welcome to the last video in Chapter 12. In this video, we're going to be talking about backgrounds. Now, regarding CSS and everything else, when you're dealing with backgrounds, the first thing that you want to look at is background color. If you recall from the first slide of this chapter, we talked about background color very briefly, but now we're going to go into it a little more detail. When you use background color, this is basically setting the background color of the element itself. It does not carry down to other items. You can also set the background color based on color names, RGB, RGBA, Hex 6, Hex 3, and other items. To give you a good idea what background color looks like, this is a good example of background color with a hex value of FC0. You can also use images as backgrounds by using the background image property. The default of a background image, if you use it, is to tile the image right and down, so that the image covers all the available space. You can limit that, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but when you're actually loading the image, one thing I want to make sure is that a lot of guides say not to put quotes around the file path when you're locating the image. I would highly recommend it, only because if you have a file path that has a space in it, if you don't have quotes, the browser won't know what to do with the space. But if you have quotes, the browser will know what to do with the space and properly load the file. If you don't have quotes and the file name has a space, then it's going to be a little hard to diagnose what the problem is, because to you, everything's loading appropriately. But to the browser, it doesn't quite know what to do with that. So you can use either or. I would just recommend go ahead and using quotes as part of your practice. As far as getting an image to repeat, you can actually set how and what you want to repeat. Some of the options for background repeat property, again, this has no effect on the background color, just the background image, are no repeat, as in it only shows the image once and then stops. You can do repeat X, which means that it's going to repeat the image along the horizontal axis, most likely meaning the top row. Or you could say repeat Y, which is repeat along the vertical axis, or in most cases, the left column. There are some instances where you can actually use the repeat X and repeat Y. We'll get to some once we get into the Code With Me videos, but basically, if you don't know exactly how to use this, don't worry. Chances are it should come up in future lessons and possibly future projects. You can also use background position to determine the location of the start of the background image. Again, no effect on background color. You can either use one value, which is the primary location, or two values, which are basically setting the X and the Y value, separated by a space. The options are top, left, right, bottom, and center, which basically allows the image to start on the necessary side or in a corner if you provide two values. You can also include numerical values such as percent, pixels, points, EM, REM, etc., and the values can be negative. You can also use background size. This allows an image to be controlled and sized inside the element. The two options are cover and contain. Cover enlarges or reduces the background image so it covers the whole element. Contain enlarges or reduces the background image so it is as large as possible. There's easily some confusion in this, so let's see an example. For background size, let's use this nice pretty picture of Paris. Well, if we say background size cover, we can actually have the width of the image set to the width of our element, so that no matter what size we have, the image itself will cover the span of the available space. It may change in height based on how big our element is, but you can also use background position to change the exact specification of where the image will start and be displayed inside the element. On the other hand, if we say background size contain, that's going to take the exact same image and make sure it can be fitted inside the element. So no matter how big the element is, the whole entire image will be contained inside the element. So that way, the whole image can be seen. It's not exactly the best thing when it comes to large images like this in odd shapes like a long rectangle, and there are some instances where you can use contain to show the whole image. But in this example, this is a bad example because the image we have is a nice sort of squarish rectangle, but the space we have available is just a long rectangle. Next we have background attachment. This controls the scrolling of a background image. The options are scroll, so the image stays with the content and moves up and down with the page as the user scrolls, or fixed, where an image stays in a fixed location and will not move, no matter how much the user scrolls. This also works well with floated elements. If you actually want an element to float and stay with the user as they scroll, you can also say that it will have a background attachment of fixed. You can also mix all of your items in the background to use a shorthand. So color, image, position, and size, you can actually merge all together in this one nice shorthand. But keep in mind, I want to draw your attention to this slash, because this is separating the position and the size. Now for background, it does have a specific order, only because you need to know how you're telling the browser what to do and what order of items you're going to be putting them in. So the slash separates the position from the size. Otherwise, if you just say right and top, then it may think that your position is going to be right and your size is going to be top, but that doesn't make any sense. If you just say right and cover, then again, the browser doesn't know whether or not you're trying to put things in the appropriate place. So by using the slash, you separate the position and the size. You can use multiple backgrounds by just using a comma and listing the different elements, and they will actually be stacked on top of each other. So this is more of a headache than it's worth, but you can use multiple backgrounds and stack all of them on top of each other. If you do this, make sure you have a way to know which ones are stacked on which location. Otherwise, you're going to get very lost on knowing which ones are on what stack. Next, let's talk about opacity. Now, opacity and transparency with RGBA are very different. With opacity, this sets the opacity of an element, the whole element and everything in it and around it, between visible and hidden. The values are between 0 and 1 in decimal value. So if we take a look at this original square over here without the image, it just says Hello World is blue and has a nice black border. Well, by saying RGBA and then the specified color values and then 0.5, this is setting the background transparency only. So everything in the element is still viewed and is still viewable. But if we set opacity, that means that the element itself and everything in it now has the opacity of 0.5 or 50%. So the text, the backgrounds, the border, and the image are all now semi-transparent, which makes it a little hard to see when we're trying to deal with seeing things on our page. So when we're dealing with a transparent background, make sure you only use RGBA. If you want to make everything inside the element transparent, then you can use the opacity. Chances are you'll be using RGBA 1,000 times more than the opacity property. Lastly, let's talk about boxed shadow. It's very similar to text shadow, but provides a shadow for box elements. Basically, anything that uses the box model. The values are the same using the X, Y, blur, and color values. So on the left, we have a basic value or basic example of 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 5 pixels, and the color of black to give the box a nice distance a nice distance box shadow to give it a nice sort of 3D effect. On the right, we have a glowing effect by setting the X and Y to 0 and setting the blur to 5 pixels. So this way, since the X and Y is set to 0, the 5 pixel glow, or the 5-pixel blur, allows for a glow around the actual box. One big difference between box shadow and text shadow is that box shadow also allows for the inset value. So if you have the XY blur and color and you add inset, now instead of the shadow being on the outside, the shadow is now on the inside. Using the exact same distance, X and Y values, it's just now coming from the inside of the box versus the outside. I would recommend you playing around with this, seeing what different values and options and creativity combinations you can come up with, because this is actually a pretty cool feature and one of my favorite ones for CSS. That is everything for Chapter 12. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about CSS and some of the more advanced things we can do with CSS. And we're not done yet. We still have about 4 more chapters to go with CSS. If you have any questions about anything in CSS, HTML, anything in the book, or anything in Chapter 12, please send me an email or hit me up on Twitter and I'll get back to you with the best possible answer. Please take a minute to go over the Code With Me videos so you can actually see the different activities and the different values for what we just covered in action.